Kirk, Russell Amos. Political philosopher and journalist, he has been an active ally of William Buckley in investigating the American educational scene during the past decade and in reporting his observations to the American public. He was born on October the 19th, 1918 in Plymouth, Michigan. He received his BA from Michigan State University, 1940, MA from Duke University, 1941, and D. Lit, St Andrews University, Scotland, 1952. He served in the United States Army, 1942-6. He was Assistant Professor of Civilization, Michigan State, 1946-53. In 1954-5, he was a Guggenheim Research Fellow. Since 1955, he has been a leading contributor to National Review, and since 1956, editor of Conservative Review. He has also been Professor of Political Science at Post College, Long Island, since 1956. The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Santa Ana, Chicago, Regnery, 1953, 458 pages. A Program for Conservatives, Chicago, Regnery, 1954, 325 pages. Academic Freedom, An Essay and Definition, Chicago, Regnery, 1955, 210 pages. Lydecker, Kurt Friedrich. Linguist, modern European languages and Sanskrit. He has changed his field of teaching and research since World War II to include teaching and research in philosophy and cultural history. In addition to further language research, he has advocated a strong federal role in education throughout his academic career. He was born on September the 11th, 1902 in Gera, Germany, and is a naturalized American citizen. From Oberlin College, he received his BA 1924 and MA 1925. From 1925 to 1927, he was a fellow at the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD in 1927. From 1927 to 1944, he instructed modern languages, especially scientific German, at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. From 1944 to 1948, he instructed in scientific German for the United States Air Force. He taught philosophy during the summer session at Leahy University in 1948. He has been professor of philosophy at Mary Washington College, Virginia, since 1948. He received a Fulbright research grant for India, 1950-2, and he was a United States Department of State lecturer on education in West Germany, 1954-5. He was employed by the United States Information Service in Thailand, 1955-7, and in 1956-7 he was visiting American lecturer in philosophy at the Buddhist University, Bangkok, Thailand. Josiah Royce, An Indian Thought, New York, Kailas, 1931, 32 pages. A Pragmatic Approach to Scientific German, Troy, New York, Swift, 1941, 209 pages. Yankee Teacher, The Life of William Torrey Harris, New York, Philosophical Library, 1946, 648 pages. Mann, Horace. Lawyer, politician, education administrator, he had little to do with the pre-1837 Massachusetts movement for public education, but he espoused the cause of state schools with zeal for the remainder of his life, and many of his ideas found wide acclaim. He is traditionally regarded as the father of American state education. He was born on May 4th, 1796 in Franklin, Massachusetts. He received his BA from Brown University in 1819. He was tutor of Latin and Greek at Brown from 1819 to 1821. He graduated from the Litchfield, Connecticut Law School, the most famous in New England, in 1823, and he was admitted to the Massachusetts bar the same year. From 1823 to 1833, he practiced law at Dedham, Massachusetts. He married Charlotte Messer, the daughter of President Asa Messer of Brown, in 1830. She died in 1832. He served in the Massachusetts House of Representatives 1827-33 and in the Massachusetts Senate 1833-7. He was President of the Senate 1835-7 with the passage of the Education Law on April 20th, 1837. He was appointed State Secretary of Education in place of James Carter, who had been the principal lobbyist for the bill. This was mainly due to the influence of Edmund Dwight, a leading Boston industrialist and later president of the Western Railway. Dwight actually placed considerable funds at the disposal of Mann on behalf of the state education program. Mann resigned to succeed John Quincy Adams in the United States House of Representatives in 1848. Dwight died the next year. Mann's political position in his native state was further injured by a conflict with Daniel Webster, and he was defeated as candidate for governor 1852. At this point, Mann, a Unitarian, was called upon to be first president of the new college, Antioch, at Yellow Springs, Ohio. During his 7 years as president, he also taught philosophy, political economy, and theology. The college was sold for debts in 1859, partly due to Mann's mismanagement. Mann had a nervous breakdown and died the same year. The college was reorganized and restored. Mann was survived by his second wife, Mary Peabody Mann, the sister of Elizabeth Peabody, and their 3 children. The Life and Works of Horace Mann, 5 volumes, Boston, Lee and Shepherd, 1891. Lecture on Education, Boston, Marsh, Capon, Leon and Webb, 1840, 62 pages. Answer to the Rejoinder of 29 Boston Schoolmasters, Boston, W.B. Fowle and N. Capon, 1845, 124 pages. Lectures on Education, Boston, L. N. Ide, 1850, 338 pages. The Demands of the Age on Colleges, New York, Fowler and Wells, 1857, 86 pages. Marble, Albert Prescott. Education administrator, he opposed the child-centered educational philosophy of Francis Parker on the ground that it would result in the corruption of the children. The progressive educators have unanimously recognized in Parker their most significant practical forerunner. Therefore, Marble launched the first conscious counterattack against what later came to be known as progressive education. He was born on May 21st, 1836, in Valsborough, Maine. He received his B.A. from Waterville, later Colby College in 1861. He went to Wisconsin, where he instructed in mathematics at Welland University, 1861-6, and served as a recruiter for the Union Army. He was principal of the Worcester Academy, 1866-8, and superintendent of public schools, Worcester, Massachusetts, 1868-1893. From 1893-6, he was superintendent of schools at Omaha, Nebraska, and from 1896 to 1902, he was the superintendent of high schools in New York City. Marble was president of the Massachusetts State Teachers Association for 3 terms, and he served for many years as secretary and later president of the National Educational Association. He was also a member of the Board of Visitors of Wellesley College for 20 years. He died on March 25, 1906. Several of his standard school textbooks on geography were still in use at the time of his death. The Powers and Duties of School Officers and Teachers, Syracuse, New York, Bardeen, 1887, 27 pages. Sanitary Conditions for Schoolhouses, United States Bureau of Education, Washington, D.C., 1891, 123 pages. Metzger, Walter Paul. Historian. He has worked extensively with Richard Hofstadter during the past 10 years on projects relating to the history of education, vide Hofstadter. He is also concerned with the role of religion in American education. He was born on May 15, 1922, in New York City. His undergraduate study at City College was interrupted by service in the United States Army, 1942-5. He received his BS from City College 1946, his MA from Columbia 1947, and his PhD from the State University of Iowa 1950. He was instructor in history at Iowa from 1947 to 50 and at Columbia from 1950 to 3. He was promoted to assistant professor at Columbia in 1953 and to associate professor in 1956. Academic Freedom in the Age of the University, New York, Columbia, paperback, 1961. Moleman, Conrad Henry. Congregationalist educator and professor of theology, he has been a leading spokesman for many years on behalf of eliminating Christian observances in the public schools. He considers such observances contrary to the separation of church and state and an unnecessary affront to Jews and other non-Christian religious groups. He was born on May 26, 1879, in Meriden, Connecticut. He received his A.B. from the University of Michigan in 1902. He taught secondary school prior to entering the University of Rochester for graduate study. He received his M.A. from Rochester in 1907, and from 1907 to 1944 he was faculty member of the Colgate Rochester Divinity School. He received his PhD in the field of art criticism from the University of Michigan in 1918, and he was awarded an honorary D.D. by Rochester in 1929. From 1952 to 1955, he was visiting professor of education at the University of Southern California. The Catholic Protestant Mind, Some Aspects of Religious Liberty in the United States, New York, Harper, 1929, 211 pages. The Christian-Jewish Tragedy, A Study in Religious Prejudice, Rochester, New York, Leo Hart, 1933, 285 pages. The American Constitutions and Religion, Bern, Indiana, N.P. 1938, 142 pages. Protestantism's Challenge, An Historical Study of the Survival Value of Protestantism, New York, Harper, 1939, 286 pages. In Defense of the American Way of Life, Bern, Indiana, N.P., 1939, 31 pages. School and Church, The American Way, An Historical Approach to the Problem of Religious Instruction in Public Schools, New York, Harper, 1944. Parker, Francis Wayland. Educational administrator, noted for his educational experiments, he was praised by John Dewey in the New Republic, July 9, 1930, as the father of progressive education. The most decisive phase of his child-centered experiments was in Massachusetts during the 1880s. He was born on October 9, 1837, in Bedford, New Hampshire. He attended school at Mount Vernon, New Hampshire, until 1853. Then, at the age of 15, he began teaching elementary school himself. He taught school in New Hampshire from 1853 to 1859, and in Illinois from 1859 to 1861. He hastened home on the outbreak of the Civil War to join a New Hampshire regiment. He was commissioned lieutenant at once, and he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel in August 1864. Shortly afterward, he received a battle wound. After convalescence, he retired from military service and returned to teaching in New Hampshire. He was normal school director at Dayton, Ohio, 1870-2. He visited German universities from 1872 to 1875 and acquired many new ideas and educational techniques. He began his own experiments in 1875 after he was appointed superintendent of schools at Quincy, Massachusetts. From 1880 to 3, he was Boston school supervisor, and in 1883, he was appointed principal of the Cook County Normal School in Chicago. He also established a private institute of education in Chicago, which was transferred to the University of Chicago in 1899. As a result, Parker served as first director of the School of Education, University of Chicago, from 1899 until his death in 1902. Notes of talks on teaching, July to August, 1882 lectures, New York, Kellogg, 1883, 182 pages, second edition, 1903. How to Study Geography, Englewood, Illinois, Parker, 1888, 400 pages. Second edition, 1890, third edition, 1892. Uncle Robert's Geography, with Nellie Helm, edited by W.T. Harris. 4 volumes, New York, D. Appleton, 1897 to 1904. Talks on Pedagogics, an outline of the theory of concentration, based on the July 1891 Chautauqua Lectures, New York, John Day, 1937, 342 pages. Peabody, Elizabeth Palmer. Founder of the American kindergarten and precursor of progressive education, she was a champion of the experiments of Colonel Parker at Quincy and Boston, and her campaigns for educational reform are widely regarded as having prepared the way for the later acceptance of Dewey's educational theories. She was born on May 16, 1804 in Billerica, Massachusetts. Her father was a medical doctor, and her mother, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, conducted a private school. She studied at her mother's school prior to opening one of her own at the age of 16 in Lancaster, 1820. 2 years later, she started another school in Boston and began to study Greek under Ralph Waldo Emerson, who converted her to Transcendentalism. Her modest efforts at starting schools proved abortive, and from 1823 to 1825, she was a governess in Maine. Then for 9 years, she was secretary to the Unitarian philosopher William Ellery Channing. From 1834 to 1836, she was the assistant of Bronson Alcott at his Temple School. From 1836 to 1839, she was at home with her parents. Returning to Boston, she founded a successful bookshop where the Transcendentalist Dial was published. 1842 to 3. She founded and conducted the first American kindergarten, 1860 to 7. From 1867 to 1868, she studied at Hamburg, Germany, and from 1873 to 5, she published the Kindergarten Messenger. In her later years, she travelled and supported numerous educational enterprises, including one by Sarah Winnemucca for the education of the Indians in Nevada, which turned out to be nothing more than a clever fraud, in which she and her friends, due to their financial assistance, were the victims. She died on January 3rd, 1894. Record of a school, Bronson Alcott School, New York, Leavitt, Lord, 1835, 198 pages. Revised edition, 1874, 297 pages. Reminiscences of Reverend William Ellery Channing, D.D., Boston Roberts, 1880, 459 pages. Lectures in the Training Schools for Kindergartens, Boston, Heath, 1886, 226 pages. A Last Evening with Alston and Other Papers, Boston, Lothrop, 1886, 350 pages. Powdermaker, Hortense. She was born on December 24th, 1901 in Philadelphia. She received her B.A. from Goucher College, 1920, and her Ph.D. in Anthropology from the University of London, 1928. She was a specialist for the Australian government, 1928 to 30, and a research assistant at Yale University, 1930 to 2, 1934 to 8. She worked on a Social Science Research Council grant in Mississippi, 1932 to 4. She has been Professor of Cultural Anthropology at Queen's College, Flushing, New York, since 1938. She was President of the American Ethnological Society in 1946. She was Visiting Professor at Yale, 1943 to 4, UCLA, 1946 and 7, and Columbia, 1958 and 9. She was Research Associate at the William Allenson White Institute of Psychiatry, 1947 to 54, and in 1954 to 5, she was a Guggenheim Research Fellow in Africa. Physical Education Play Activities for Girls in Junior and Senior High Schools, New York, A.S. Barnes, 1938, 369 pages. After Freedom, A Cultural Study in the Deep South, New York, Viking, 1939, 408 pages. Visual Aids for Teaching Sports, New York, A.S. Barnes, 1940, 28 pages. Hollywood, The Dream Factory, Little, Brown, Boston, 1950, 342 pages. London, Seeker and Warburg, 1951. Pressy, Sidney Levitt. He was born on December the 20th, 1888 in Brooklyn, New York. He received his A.B. from Williams College, 1912, and his graduate degrees from Harvard, A.M. 1915, Ph.D. in Psychology, 1917. He was Instructor of Psychology at Indiana University, 1917 to 21. From 1921 to 1959, he instructed in the field of educational psychology at Ohio State University, where he was appointed full professor in 1929. He was Visiting Professor of Educational Psychology at UCLA, 1959 to 60. Introduction to the Use of Standard Tests with Luella Cole Pressy, Yonkers-on-Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1922, 863 pages, second edition, 1926, third edition, 1931. Mental Abnormality and Deficiency with Luella Cole Pressy, New York, Macmillan, 1926, 356 pages. Research Adventures in University Teaching, et al., Bloomington, Illinois, Public School Publishing Company, 1927, 152 pages. Psychology and the New Education, New York, Harper, 1933, 594 pages. A Casebook of Research in Educational Psychology with J.E. Janney, New York, Harper, 1937, 432 pages. Life, A Psychological Survey, et al., New York, Harper, 1939, 654 pages. Pruett, Laureen Livingston. She was born on November the 3rd, 1896 in Millersburg, Tennessee. She received her B.S. from Chattanooga, 1918, her M.A. from Clark, 1920, and her Ph.D. from Columbia, 1924. From 1924 to 1926, she was research psychologist for Macy Department Stores, and from 1926 to 27, she was research associate in psychology at the New York University Graduate School. From 1927 to 32, she was lecturer and director of research for the New York Committee on Social Attitudes. She was study director for the National Council on Women, 1932 and 3, and editor of Personnel Studies for the American Women's Association, 1934 and 5. From 1936 to 1938, she was research consultant for the Progressive Education Association. From 1938 to 1943, she was an editor for the National Bureau of Economic Research, and from 1943 to 1945, she was a supervisor of radio propaganda broadcasts overseas for the Office of War Information. She has been a consulting psychologist in New York City since 1945. Since 1954, she has also served on the staff of the Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital in New York City and as research associate with the New York Medical College. Women and Leisure, A Study of Social Waste, introduction by H. E. Barnes, New York, Dutton, 1924, 225 pages. G. Stanley Hall, A Biography of a Mind, New York, D. Appleton, 1926, 266 pages. The Parent and the Happy Child, New York, Henry Holt, 1932, 290 pages. School for Love, Garden City, New York, Doubleday, Doran, 1936, 277 pages. Working with Words, A Survey of Vocational Opportunities for Young Writers, New York, Funk and Wagnalls, 1940, 210 pages. Reisman, David. He was born on September the 22nd, 1909 in Philadelphia. From Harvard, he received his B.A. in 1931 and LL.B. 1994. He was admitted to the Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. bars in 1935. After working a further year at Harvard as research fellow, 1934 and 5, from 1935 to 1937, he was law clerk to Justice Louis D. Brandeis of the United States Supreme Court. He was professor of law at the University of Buffalo, 1937 to 42. From 1942 to 1946, he was assistant to the treasurer of the Sperry Gyroscope Company, Lake Success, York. From 1946 to 1958, he was professor at the University of Chicago. Since 1958, he has been Henry Ford II Professor at Harvard. He was visiting professor at Yale University, 1948 to 9. Constraint and Variety in American Education, Garden City, New York, Doubleday, Anchor Books, 1958. Rosenstock-Huessy, Eugen. He was born on July 6, 1888 in Berlin, Germany. He studied at the Universities of Zurich and Berlin, and from Heidelberg he received his JD 1909 and PhD 1923. He was an assistant instructor at Heidelberg for several years prior to joining the Faculty of Law at the University of Leipzig, 1912 to 19. He edited the newspaper of the Daimler-Benz Automobile Company at Stuttgart, 1919 to 21, and the following year he served as director of the Labour Academy at Frankfurt, AM. He taught psychology at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, 1922 to 23, and sociology and the history of law at the University of Breslau, 1923 to 33. From 1933 to 1936, he was visiting professor at Harvard. He became a naturalized American citizen and he was professor of social philosophy at Dartmouth from 1936 until his retirement in 1957. He was visiting professor of social philosophy at the University of Köln, Germany, 1961 to 2. Out of Revolution, An Autobiography of Western Man, New York, Morrow, 1938, 795 pages. Rugg, Harold Ordway. He was born on January the 17th, 1886 in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. He reluctantly agreed to leave high school in 1902 at the age of 16 in order to help his family by working in a mill for 2 years during a temporary emergency. This experience had a basic effect on his views. He completed his high school study in the summer of 1904 and then entered Dartmouth, where he received his B.S. in 1908 and his M.S. in engineering in 1909. He taught at Dartmouth prior to studying at Columbia, where he received his PhD in 1915. He was consultant for the Grand Rapids School Project 1915-16 and an investigator for the Civil Service Commission, Washington, D.C., 1916-1920. He was Professor of Education at Teachers College, Columbia from 1920 to 1956. He died on May 17, 1960. Statistical Methods Applied to Education. E.P. Cubberley, Editor, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1917, 410 pages. The Child-Centered School, An Appraisal of the New Education, with Anne Schumacher, Yonkers and Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1928, 359 pages. Teacher's Guide for a History of American Government and Culture, Boston, Ginn & Co., 1931. A History of American Government and Culture, America's March to Democracy, Boston, Ginn & Co., 1931, 635 pages, second edition, 1937. Changing Governments and Changing Cultures, The World's March Toward Democracy, Boston, Ginn & Company, 1932, 701 pages, second edition, 1933. The revised third edition, 1937, 752 pages, carried a different subtitle, Democracy versus Dictatorship. The Great Technology, Social Chaos and the Public Mind, New York, John Day, 1933, 308 pages. Social Reconstruction, Study Guide for Group and Class Discussion with Martin Kruger, New York, John Day, 1933, 140 pages. American Life and the School Curriculum, Next Steps Towards Schools of Living, Boston, Ginn & Company, 1936, 471 pages. America's March Toward Democracy, A History of American Life, Political and Social, Boston, Ginn & Co., 1937, 515 pages. Changing Civilizations in the Modern World, A Textbook in World Geography with Historical Backgrounds, Boston, Ginn & Co., 1938, 586 pages. Democracy and the Curriculum, Third Yearbook of the John Dewey Society, New York, Appleton Century, 1939. That Men May Understand. An American in the Long Armistice, New York Doubleday, Doran, 1941, 355 pages. Now is the Moment, New York, Dual, Sloan & Pierce, 1943. Foundations for American Education, Yonkers and Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1947. The Teacher in School and Society, An Introduction to Education, Yonkers and Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1950. The Teacher of Teachers, Frontiers of Theory and Practice in Teacher Education, New York, Harper, 1952. Russell, James Earl. He was born on July 1st, 1864 in Hamden, New York. He received his A.B. from Cornell in 1887. From 1887 to 1890, he taught high school in Ithaca, New York, and from 1890 to 3, he was principal of the Cascadilla School in Ithaca. He studied at Jena University in Germany, 1893, and Leipzig, 1893 and 4, where he received his PhD in 1894. He continued with a year of postdoctorate study at the University of Berlin, 1894 and 5. During these years in Germany, he was European agent for the United States Bureau of Education, and he subsequently held this position from 1904 to 1927. From 1895 to 7, he was Professor of Education at the University of Colorado. From 1897 to 1927, he was Dean of Teachers College, Columbia University. After retiring as Dean, he was Richard Hoe Foundation Professor of Education from 1927 to 1932, and from 1932 to 1940 he was a member of the New Jersey State Board of Health. He died on November 4th, 1945. The Extension of University Teaching in England and America, a Study in Practical Pedagogics, New York University Press, 1895, 247 pages. German Higher Schools, The History, Organization and Methods of Secondary Education in Germany, New York, Longmans, Green, 1899, 455 pages, second edition, 1907, 489 pages. A Trend in American Education, New York, American Book Company, 1922, 240 pages. Founding Teachers College, New York, Columbia University Press, 1937, 106 pages. Sheldon, Edward Austin. He was born on October 4th, 1823 on a farm near Perry Center, New York. He attended the Perry Center Academy and Hamilton College, 1844-7. A temporary illness discouraged him from continuing toward a degree. He was partner in a landscape nursery enterprise in Oswego, New York, in 1847 until the business failed. He founded the Orphan and Free School Association of Oswego, New York, on November 28th, 1848. He married Frances Stiles, the daughter of the famous Congregationalist minister Ezra Stiles, on May 16th, 1849. He resigned from the school association and founded a private school. He was an active lobbyist for a public educational law in New York. The law passed in 1853, and he served as superintendent of public schools at Syracuse, New York, 1853-60. He became president of the New York State Teachers Association and editor of the New York Teacher in 1860. From 1862 until his death in 1897, he was principal of the first municipal teacher training school in the United States at Oswego, New York. A Manual of Elementary Instruction, containing a graduated course of object lessons, New York. Scribner, Armstrong, 1862, 465 pages, revised edition, 1873, 471 pages. The Teacher's Manual of Instruction and Reading, with E. H. Barlow, New York, Scribner, Armstrong, 1875, 159 pages. Autobiography of Edward Austin Sheldon, New York, Ives Butler, 1911, 252 pages. Segurist, Henry Ernest. He was born on April 7th, 1891 in Paris, France. He studied at the Zurich Gymnasium, 1904-10, University of London, 1911 and 12, University of Munich, 1914 and 15, and the University of Zurich, 1912 and 13, 1915-17. He received his MD at Zurich in 1917. Following several years of private practice, he was lecturer in the history of medicine at the Universities of Zurich, 1921-5, and Leipzig, 1925-31. He emigrated to the United States in 1931. From 1932 to 1947, he was director of the Institute for the History of Medicine, Johns Hopkins University. From 1947 to 1956, he was research associate in medicine at Yale University. He edited the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, 1933 to 1947, and the American Review of Soviet Medicine, 1943 to 8. He died at Zurich on March 17th, 1957. The Great Doctors, A Biographical History of Medicine, New York, W. W. Norton, 1933, 436 pages. First edition, Munich, 1932. Translated by Eden and Cedar Paul. Socialized Medicine in the Soviet Union, New York, W. W. Norton, 1937, 378 pages. The University at the Crossroads, Addresses and Essays, New York, Henry Schumann, 1946. Sweat, John. He was born on July the 31st, 1830, on a farm near Pittsfield, New Hampshire. After a rudimentary education, he began his own career as a teacher at Buck Street, New Hampshire, 1847 and 8, and West Randolph, Massachusetts, 1849 and 50. He sailed from Boston to San Francisco via Cape Horn, 1852 and 3. Following a protracted illness, he tried his hand at mining and ranching prior to his return to teaching. He taught at the Rincon School in San Francisco, 1853 to 62. In the latter year, he married Mary Tracy, the daughter of Frederick Tracy, a San Francisco judge. A few months later, he campaigned successfully for the elective post of California State School Superintendent, 1862 to 8. In this capacity, he left a lasting imprint on the California school system. From 1868 to 95, he was active in the San Francisco schools, and he served a term as San Francisco City School Superintendent. He retired to his farm at Martinez, California in 1895. He was a close friend of Henry George. He died on August the 22nd, 1913. A History of the Public School System of California, San Francisco, Bancroft, 1876, 246 pages. Methods of Teaching, New York, Harper, 1880, 326 pages. Second edition, American Book Company, 1880. American Public Schools, History and Pedagogics, New York, American Book Company, 1900, 320 pages. The Elementary Schools of California, San Francisco, Department of Education, 1904, 16 pages. Public Education in California, with Personal Reminiscences, New York, American Book Company, 1911, 320 pages. Tenenbaum, Samuel. Clinical psychologist and educator, the success of his biography of Kilpatrick in 1951 has prompted him to devote his full time to teaching and writing in the field of American education. His biography was an uncompromising defense of Kilpatrick's progressive education ideas. He was born on January the 12th, 1902, in New York City. He received his B.S. from the University of Missouri, 1924, his M.A. from Columbia, 1927, and his Ph.D. from New York University in 1939. His work from 1927 to 1959 was mainly in clinical psychology at the Lafargue Clinic in New York City and the Adler Institute of Individual Psychology. He was visiting professor of education at Brooklyn College, 1947-8. He has been Associate Professor of Education at Yeshiva University in New York City since 1959. William Hurd Kilpatrick, Trailblazer in Education, New York, Harper, 1951. Thorndike, Edward Lee. Pragmatist educator, he was considered conservative by some colleagues, but he never disagreed with Dewey on major issues. He subscribed to the idea originally held by Herbert of Cherbury that controversy could be eliminated by so-called objective science. He was born on August the 31st, 1874, in Williamsburg, Massachusetts. He received his A.B. from Wesleyan University, 1895, his M.A. from Harvard, 1897, and his Ph.D. from Columbia, 1898. He was Instructor of Education at Western Reserve University, 1898 and 9. From 1899 to 1941, he was Professor of Educational Psychology at Teachers College, Columbia. He was William James Lecturer at Harvard, 1942 and 3. He died on August 9, 1949. Educational Psychology, New York, Lenica and Buchner, 1903, 177 pages. Second edition revised, 1910, 248 pages. Third edition revised, 3 volumes, 1913 to 14. Volume 1, The Original Nature of Man. Volume 2, The Psychology of Learning. Volume 3, Mental Work and Fatigue. Fourth edition, 1921. An Introduction to the Theory of Mental and Social Measurements. New York, Science Press, 1904, 212 pages. The Principles of Teaching Based on Psychology. New York, Seiler, 1906, 293 pages. Individuality. Boston, Houghton Mifflin, 1911, 55 pages. Animal Intelligence. Experimental Studies, New York, Macmillan, 1911, 297 pages. Education, a First Book, New York, Macmillan, 1912, 292 pages. Ventilation in Relation to Mental Work, et al., New York, Teachers College, 1916, 83 pages. The Measurement of Intelligence, New York, Teachers College, 1925, 613 pages. Adult Learning, et al., New York, Macmillan, 1928, 335 pages. Elementary Principles of Education with A.I. Gates, New York, Macmillan, 1929, 335 pages. An Experimental Study of Rewards, New York, Teachers College, 1933, 72 pages. The Psychology of Wants, Interests and Attitudes, New York, Appleton Century, 1935, 310 pages. Adult Interests, et al., New York, Macmillan, 1935, 265 pages. The Teaching of Controversial Subjects, English Lecture, 1937, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1937, 39 pages. Your City, New York, Harcourt Brace, 1939, 204 pages. Human Nature and the Social Order, New York, Macmillan, 1940, 1019 pages. Van Dusen, Henry Pitney. He was born on December the 11th, 1897 in Philadelphia. He received his A.B. from Princeton, 1919, his B.D. from Union Theological Seminary, 1924, and his Ph.D., Edinburgh University, 1932. He became an ordained Presbyterian minister in 1924. He joined the faculty of Union Theological Seminary in 1926. He was Dean of Students, 1931-9, full professor since 1936, and president of Union Theological Seminary and Auburn Theological Seminary since 1945. He is editor of the Ecumenical Review, director, Fund for the Republic, trustee, Rockefeller Foundation, and a member of the Board of Foreign Missions, United Presbyterian Church. In Quest of Life's Meaning, Hints Toward a Christian Philosophy of Life for Students, New York, Association Press, 1926, 140 pages. God in These Times, New York, Scribner's, 1935, 194 pages. God in Education, New York, Scribner's, 1951. Van Til, Cornelius. Philosopher, Christian apologist. Born on May 3, 1895 in the Netherlands, coming to U.S. in 1905. Graduates, Calvin College, Princeton Seminary, Princeton University, Ph.D. 1927. Taught at Princeton Seminary, resigned in dissent at seminary reorganization. Joined faculty of Westminster Seminary. Author of numerous works: The New Modernism, Common Grace, The Defense of the Faith, Christianity and Barthianism, etc. Author of various articles on education, including widely circulated pamphlet, reprinted from a symposium on the dilemma of education. Washburn, Carlton Woolsey. He was born on December 2nd, 1889 in Chicago, Illinois. He received his A.B. at Stanford 1913 and he taught in the Frederick Burke School, San Francisco, 1914-19. He married Helowitz Chandler in 1912. She became a feature writer for the Chicago Daily News after he obtained control of the Winnetka Public Schools and began his experimental progressive school program in 1919. He visited Russia in 1925 and 1927, where he approved of what he called the comparable Soviet experiments in progressive education. New Schools in the Old World, with Myron M. Stearns, New York, John Day, 1926, 174 pages. Results of Practical Experiments in Fitting Schools to Individuals, a survey of the Winnetka Public Schools, with Mabel Vogel and William S. Gray, Bloomington, Illinois, Public School Publishing Company, 1926, 135 pages. What Children Like to Read, the Winnetka Graded Book List, with Mabel Vogel, New York, Rand McNally, 1926, 286 pages. Better Schools, a survey of progressive education in American public schools, with Myron M. Stearns, New York, John Day, 1928, 342 pages. Adjusting the School to the Child, Practical First Steps, Yonkers-on-Hudson, New York, World Book Company, 1932, 189 pages. Remakers of Mankind, New York, John Day, 1932, 339 pages. A Living Philosophy of Education, New York, John Day, 1940, 585 pages. The World's Good, Education for World-Mindedness, New York, John Day, 1954. Watson, John Broadus. He was born on January 9, 1878 in Greenville, South Carolina. He received his A.M. from Furman University in 1900. He was a graduate student at the University of Chicago from 1900 to 1903, where he studied under Dewey. He received his Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Chicago in 1903. He was a research associate and instructor in psychology at the University of Chicago, 1903-8. He was professor of psychology at Johns Hopkins University, 1908 to 1920. From 1908 to 1915, he was editor of Psychology Review, and from 1915 to 1927, he was editor of the Journal of Experimental Psychology. He was appointed Vice President of J. Walter Thompson Company, 1924, and Vice President of William Etzley & Co., 1936. He died in 1958. Animal Education, University of Chicago Press, 1903, 122 pages. Behavior, An Introduction to Comparative Psychology, New York, Henry Holt, 1914, 439 pages. Suggestions of Modern Science Concerning Education, et al., New York, Macmillan, 1917. Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist, Philadelphia, Lippincott, 1919, 429 pages, revised edition 1924, 448 pages. Behaviorism, New York, The People's Institute, 1924, 251 pages. Second edition, Norton, 1925. Third edition, revised, Norton, 1930, 308 pages. The Ways of Behaviorism, New York, Harper, 1928, 144 pages. This has been a Chalcedon Foundation production, produced by Grace Community School and Nicene Covenant Church. Published by Ross House Books. Copyright 1963, 1968, 1972, 1976, 1979, 1995, Mark R. Rushdoony. If you enjoyed this audiobook, be sure to visit calcedon.edu for more books and audiobooks by R.J. Rushdoony.